February 23, 1964, Daytona International Speedway. Richard Petty's number 43 Plymouth absolutely demolished the competition at the Daytona 500, leading 184 of the 200 laps and crossing the finish line with an average speed that shattered records. But this wasn't just another race win. This was the debut of an engine so dominant, so powerful, that it would fundamentally change American motorsports forever. That engine was the Chrysler 426 HEMI, and within a year, NASCAR would ban it.
When people talk about legendary American engines, the 426 HEMI always comes up. And there's a reason for that. This wasn't just another big block V8. This was an engine that won 26 of 62 NASCAR races in its debut season, an engine that forced sanctioning bodies to rewrite their rulebooks, an engine so feared by the competition that it spent an entire season banned from the track. And when Chrysler finally brought a street version to the public in 1966, it became the beating heart of the muscle car era, powering everything from Chargers to Roadrunners to those wild-winged Superbirds. The 426 HEMI's story is about more than horsepower numbers, though. It's about engineering brilliance, corporate politics, and the relentless pursuit of speed. It's about an engine design so effective that its basic architecture still dominates professional drag racing 6 decades later. So let's talk about why this particular 426 cubic inch V8 became a legend, how it completely rewrote the rules of American performance, and why even today, more than 50 years after production ended, the HEMI name still commands respect.
To understand why the 426 HEMI was so dominant, you need to understand what makes a hemispherical combustion chamber special. The name HEMI comes from the dome-shaped, hemispherical design of the combustion chambers in the cylinder head. Now, Chrysler didn't invent this concept. Hemispherical combustion chambers had been around since the early 1900s, used by everyone from Peugeot to Alfa Romeo to Mercedes. But what Chrysler did in the 1950s with their first-generation firepower HEMI engines, and then perfected in 1964 with the 426, was mass-produce this racing technology in a way nobody else had. Here's why the design matters. In a traditional wedge head engine, both the intake and exhaust valves are positioned on the same side of the combustion chamber. This creates limitations. The valves can only be so large before they start hitting each other or the cylinder walls. But with a hemispherical chamber, the intake valves are on one side and the exhaust valves are on the opposite side, splayed at an angle. This cross-flow design allows for much larger valves, and larger valves mean one thing: better breathing. An engine is basically an air pump. The more air and fuel you can get into the cylinders and the more efficiently you can expel the exhaust gases, the more power you make. The 426 HEMI's valve arrangement was exceptional. The valves sat at a 58.5-degree angle from each other, creating maximum valve area for a given bore size. In fact, the total valve area on a HEMI actually exceeded the bore diameter, something that's geometrically impossible with a conventional wedge head. This meant the engine could inhale and exhale like nothing else on the track. The cross-flow path also promoted better scavenging, where the incoming fresh air fuel mixture helps push out the exhaust gases on the other side of the chamber. It's almost like the cylinder gets a better cleanse between firing cycles. But there was a trade-off. The hemispherical design required a complex valve train. You couldn't just have a single camshaft activating all the valves. Instead, Chrysler used a dual rocker arm setup with long push rods reaching up to valves positioned on opposite sides of the chamber. This added weight, complexity, and cost. The cylinder heads themselves were massive and heavy. The whole engine, with its big heads and substantial block, weighed considerably more than a comparable wedge head engine. But when you're chasing wins on the racetrack, weight is less important than power. And the 426 HEMI had power to spare. The 426 HEMI didn't appear out of nowhere. By the early 1960s, Chrysler had been steadily building its performance reputation with the so-called max wedge engines. These were the 413 and then 426 cubic inch wedge head engines that dominated drag racing. The 426 Max wedge was making around 415 to 425 horsepower in top trim, which was serious power for the time. But by 1963, Chrysler's racing engineers realized they were hitting the limits of what the wedge head design could do in NASCAR competition. Ford was getting more competitive, and Pontiac was always a threat. So, Tom Hoover, who's often called the father of the 426 HEMI, along with a team of Chrysler engineers, came up with a bold plan. Take the strong bottom end of the 426 wedge engine, that deep skirt block with its beefy main bearing caps, and marry it to a completely new top end, featuring hemispherical combustion chambers. This wasn't some radical leap into the unknown. Chrysler had extensive experience with HEMI engines from the 1950s. They knew the technology worked. They knew it made power. The question was, could they develop a race-ready version in time for the 1964 Daytona 500? The answer was yes, but just barely. The project was greenlit in early 1963, giving the team roughly a year to design, test, and build enough engines for the factory race teams. The resulting 426 race HEMI featured iron cylinder heads with massive ports, a 12.5-to-1 compression ratio, an aggressive camshaft with over 300 degrees of duration, and for NASCAR applications, a single 4-barrel carburetor mounted on a special intake manifold. For drag racing, they used dual 4-barrel carburetors on a cross-ram intake. The official rating was 425 horsepower, which everyone knew was conservative. In reality, these engines were producing well over 500 horsepower. When Richard Petty fired up that HEMI-powered Plymouth at Daytona in February 1964, the competition knew they were in trouble. Petty didn't just win, he dominated. Plymouth and Dodge swept the top positions. 3 HEMIs finished 1, 2, 3, with a 4th and 5th place. It was total dominance, and it continued throughout the season. HEMI-powered cars won 26 of the 62 Grand National races in 1964. Richard Petty won his first NASCAR championship. The 426 HEMI was, in every sense, a game-changer.
But here's where the story gets interesting. NASCAR, even back in 1964, was as much about politics as it was about racing. The sanctioning body had ruled that engines used in competition had to be available in production cars sold to the public. The idea was to maintain the stock in stock car racing. The problem was, in 1964, you couldn't walk into a Dodge or Plymouth dealership and buy a car with a 426 HEMI. It was purely a race engine, hand-built in limited numbers for factory teams. Bill France, NASCAR's founder and the iron-fisted ruler of the sport, saw the HEMI's dominance and the complaints rolling in from Ford and GM teams. In October 1964, just months after Petty's championship season, France dropped the hammer. For 1965, the 426 HEMI would not be allowed in NASCAR competition unless it was available in production vehicles. The official reasoning was that it violated the homologation rules. The real reason was more complex. Some people said France was worried about speeds getting too high. Several drivers had been killed in 1964. Others said Ford, which was NASCAR's biggest manufacturer supporter at the time, had threatened to pull out if the HEMI wasn't reined in. Chrysler's response was swift and dramatic. They boycotted NASCAR for 1965. Richard Petty, the reigning champion, didn't race a single NASCAR Grand National event that year. Instead, Chrysler redirected their factory teams to drag racing, where the HEMI was still legal and still dominant. Petty even campaigned a special HEMI-powered Plymouth Barracuda funny car with "Outlawed" painted on the door, a not-so-subtle dig at NASCAR. The 1965 NASCAR season was a disaster. With Chrysler gone and GM still under a corporate racing ban, it became essentially a Ford exhibition series. Attendance plummeted. Fans wanted to see competitive racing, not a parade. By mid-season, France was scrambling to bring Chrysler back. In June, NASCAR modified the rules. The HEMI could return, but only in full-size cars and only with reduced displacement, down to 405 cubic inches instead of 426. Chrysler quickly developed the A117 engine,
a short-stroke 404 cubic inch HEMI that actually revved higher and made just as much power as the 426. Richard Petty came back and won 4 races in rapid succession. The HEMI was back, and it was clear that even a handicapped version was still a force. But Chrysler had learned its lesson. If NASCAR wanted production engines, Chrysler would give them production engines. In 1966, Chrysler introduced what they called the A102 Street HEMI. This was a version of the 426 designed specifically for street use and mass production. Well, mass production is relative. Only about 9,778 street HEMIs were built between 1966 and 1971. But it was enough to satisfy NASCAR's homologation requirements and let the HEMI return to the track without restrictions. The street HEMI retained the same 426 cubic inch displacement, the same bore and stroke, and the same basic hemispherical head design as the race engine, but there were crucial differences. The compression ratio was dropped from 12.5 to 1 to 10.25 to 1, so the engine could run on pump gas instead of racing fuel. The camshaft was significantly milder, with less duration and overlap, making the engine much more civilized at idle and low speeds. The cylinder heads were cast iron instead of aluminum, adding weight but reducing cost. And instead of the cross-ram manifold, the street HEMI used a cast iron dual-plane intake with 2 Carter AFB 4-barrel carburetors mounted in line. The official rating was 425 horsepower at 5,000 RPM and 490 pound-feet of torque at 4,000 RPM. Those numbers were almost certainly underrated to keep insurance companies happy. In reality, a well-tuned street HEMI was probably putting out closer to 450 horsepower or more, and the torque curve was broad and strong, giving these cars devastating acceleration from a standing start. But here's the thing about the street HEMI. It wasn't for everyone. The engine added between $800 and $1,200 to the price of a car, depending on the model. That was about a third of what a base model car cost in 1966. The HEMI also required careful attention. Those dual carburetors needed frequent tuning, the solid lifter valve train needed regular adjustment, and the engine was thirsty, drinking premium fuel at an alarming rate. These weren't grocery getters. These were serious performance machines that demanded commitment from their owners. Chrysler offered the street HEMI in a surprisingly wide range of models, though all were intermediate-sized B-body cars from either Dodge or Plymouth. In 1966, you could get the HEMI in the Dodge Charger, Dodge Coronet, Plymouth Belvedere, and Plymouth Satellite. As the years progressed, the HEMI became available in more models, the Plymouth GTX in 1967, the Dodge Super Bee and Plymouth Roadrunner in 1968, the wild winged Dodge Charger Daytona in 1969, and Plymouth Superbird in 1970, and finally the Dodge Challenger and Plymouth Cuda in 1970. Each HEMI car had to be equipped with heavy-duty everything: stronger transmissions, beefier rear axles, larger brakes, stiffer suspension. Chrysler couldn't just drop this monster engine into a standard car and call it a day. The entire drivetrain had to be reinforced to handle the power. And this is part of why HEMI cars are so valuable today. They weren't just engines, they were complete performance packages, engineered from the ground up to handle serious abuse. With the street HEMI in production, the race version returned to NASCAR in full force for 1966. Richard Petty won the Daytona 500 again. David Pearson won the NASCAR championship in a HEMI-powered Dodge. The engine's dominance continued through the late 1960s. Petty won an incredible 27 races in 1967, 10 of them in a row, which remains a NASCAR record. The HEMI was the engine to beat, and beating it was nearly impossible. In drag racing, the HEMI became absolutely legendary. Don Garlits broke the 200-mile-per-hour barrier in 1964 in a HEMI-powered dragster. The engine dominated NHRA superstock classes. Racing teams like Sox and Martin became household names campaigning HEMI-powered Plymouth Barracudas and Dodge Darts. And as drag racing evolved into the nitro-burning Top Fuel and funny car classes, the 426 HEMI's basic architecture, that hemispherical combustion chamber designed with opposed valves, became the foundation for every serious professional drag racing engine. Even today, 6 decades later, Top Fuel dragsters making over 11,000 horsepower use engines directly descended from that 1964 426 HEMI design. No other racing engine can claim that kind of longevity. On the street, HEMI cars were kings. A 1968 Roadrunner with the HEMI option could run low 13-second quarter miles right off the showroom floor. A 1970 Cuda with the HEMI and the right gearing could dip into the high 12s. These were stupid fast cars for the era, and they had the prestige to match. Seeing 426 HEMI badges on a car meant you were looking at something special, something expensive, something that could embarrass just about anything else on the road. But that success came with complications. The HEMI's dominance in NASCAR led to constant rule changes throughout the late 1960s. Manufacturers had to run different displacement limits depending on the track. Weight penalties were imposed. When Chrysler developed those crazy aerodynamic cars, the Dodge Charger Daytona and Plymouth Superbird, to win on superspeedways, NASCAR responded by banning them after just 2 seasons. By the early 1970s, NASCAR was actively working to neutralize the HEMI's advantages, eventually limiting all engines to a maximum of 358 cubic inches, which effectively ended the big block era.
So why do we still talk about the 426 HEMI more than 50 years after production ended? Why do HEMI-powered muscle cars sell for hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars at auction? Why does a 1970 HEMI Cuda convertible command over $3 million when it crosses the block? Because the 426 HEMI represents something fundamental about American car culture. It was excessive. It was impractical. It was expensive. It drank fuel like a battleship and needed constant attention. But it was also undeniably magnificently powerful. It won races. It broke records. It scared the sanctioning bodies so badly they rewrote their rules specifically to stop it. And when regular people could finally buy one, it turned their street cars into legitimate race cars. The 426 HEMI was never the most efficient engine. It wasn't the lightest or the most advanced, but it was the most dominant. It achieved its goal of winning races and selling cars more completely than perhaps any other engine in American automotive history. When you see a HEMI badge, even today, you know you're looking at something special. That's the power of a legend. The technology has moved on. Modern engines make more power from less displacement with better efficiency and lower emissions, but there's something about those massive engines with their big carburetors and mechanical simplicity that still captures our imagination. The 426 HEMI didn't just break racing records, it broke the rule book. It forced NASCAR, NHRA, and every other sanctioning body to adapt to its dominance. And in doing so, it wrote itself into the permanent record as one of the greatest, most feared, and most respected engines ever built. That's the legacy of the 426 HEMI. Not just horsepower numbers or race wins, though there were plenty of both, but the fact that an engine could be so dominant, so effective at its job, that the sport had to change around it. That's the kind of engineering achievement that transcends its era and becomes truly legendary.